Hello and welcome to the Ireland on the Fly podcast about the people and places of fly fishing in Ireland. It's the run up to Christmas, and so we've got another instalment of our book club this week on the show, where we're going to be discussing Ted Hughes and the influence of Ireland and Irish fly fishing on his poetry, with Mark Wormald, a Cambridge fellow and angler who has written a superb book called The Catch, Fishing for Ted Hughes. Plus, we have a signed copy of Mark's book to give away, so stay tuned for that. First though, Tom, I think this is an episode that listeners will actually come away from it saying, I never knew that.
Yo, definitely, Tara. This is something that I wasn't too aware of beforehand. I have a book, David Street, Fishing in Wild Places, where the foreword was written by Ted Hughes. So that's how I knew about him. When we said we'd do this, I started looking up about him more, and it's absolutely fascinating, the whole story behind him. And I definitely say I didn't know much about him, but I know when I was chatting to you beforehand, you were very much aware.
A lot of people know of Ted Hughes. They'd know the name and he's a poet and Sylvia Plath. And Mark Wormald gets into all that, so I kind of won't delve too much into that side of it. But reading Mark's book, what really caught me was Ireland, the influence of Ireland and fishing in Ireland and fly fishing in Ireland. This is why I think it's so pertinent to this episode, that I had heard interviews of Mark talking about Ted Hughes and fishing before, but this one I was mad keen to do it was because, you know, he starts visiting Ireland in, I think he says, the late 50s, early 60s, and he becomes friends with Seamus Heaney. He becomes friends with this artist, Barry Cook, who was based in Ireland, from the UK originally, comes over to Ireland, fanatical angler. Do you remember the story Mark talks about where he had his teeth? What was that?
His teeth sharpened at an angle to save him going to the clippers.
Yeah, like that's... Yeah.
That is absolutely fantastic. I mean, that's commitment to the cause.
Yeah, that is the first. I've never heard that. Just so people are wondering what we're saying. He had his teeth sharp, his incisors sharpened at an angle so that he could use them for cutting the fishing line. So he didn't have to get a nippers.
Will we put on a link to various dentists that are doing that now? It's interesting because I'd actually heard, I remember hearing, you hear different anglers because it's a small world. I'd heard of Barry Cook, but I'd heard him as a guy who fishes, who's also an artist.
Yes.
Whereas in his, probably in his own world, which was fairly big in the arts, he'd have been known as, the artist. He does a bit of fishing.
Yeah.
But everything's in perspective.
Yeah. But what I'm always looking for, I hope what people get out of these kind of book club episodes is the sense of maybe people go, oh, I must check that out. I didn't realize that, or oh, that's really interesting. And for me, I love books and writing and fly fishing about it. And you're the same. You're mad into the kind of Irish stuff as well. Is that for this kind of writing, it's like an introduction to it. I think people might go, didn't realize he actually wrote. And when you read his poetry, Ted Hughes, like for an angler, it's an absolutely like treasure trove of stuff to read. And I'd highly recommend it. It's River is the name of the Ted Hughes's collection that was published in 1983, I think it was. Yeah. And as we talk with Mark about, there's poems about September salmon, dry fly, mayfly, taking times of salmon. It's just literally like if you're a fly angler and you decided to write poetry, and you just do it in a very good way.
And this is it. And like, to be honest, I hadn't looked into his stuff much at all beforehand, but since doing this, I've looked at it. It's absolutely, it's fantastic. It really is.
Yes. So what I hope what this does is it opens a window maybe for people that go, geez, I didn't know that, and they might get a bit of interest in it, and it's another. We talk about fly angling writing, and we talk about McGuane, or we talk about, any of the greats, or Gearock, or any of this kind of stuff. But Ted Hughes doesn't come up as much. So maybe, this will kind of highlight it maybe, and that people will kind of get an interest in Hughes and his fishing writing as well.
It's like what you said, if you create an awareness for people, let them try out and find out and see it for themselves.
Yeah, exactly. And the great thing about Mark Wormald as well, he's an angler. And I think only a kind of an angler and an English lecturer could write a book like this. He's an absolute Ted Hughes.
It's definitely, it's like, and we talk about it here. We talk about it when we're chatting to Mark. When the availability came up of Ted Hughes' fishing diary, how he suddenly perked up, and how within the, should we say, the literary circles, it was looked as something that wasn't that crucial. if you're looking into Ted Hughes. But Mark had seen how important it was because Mark was an angler.
Yeah.
Mark is an angler.
Yeah, exactly. And he was able to join the dots. And the fascinating thing, again, bringing it back to Ireland, is he actually, and Mark says this, is Ted Hughes basically rediscovered his creativity, his fire, that allowed him to be such a brilliant writer in that kind of part of his career by going to Ireland and by fishing.
Yeah.
Just seemed to bring something alive in him. Like,
wasn't that bit very interesting? Mark was in about how after he was fishing, the well went dry with him. Do you know that he couldn't do anything immediately after he'd been fishing? It was almost like he was flummoxed.
Yeah.
It drained him.
Yeah, exactly. It drained him. Yeah, he couldn't put it into words, and then eventually he was able to kind of put it into his journal. Like, but look, I hope people enjoy it. Like, I have to be careful. I'm really into this kind of stuff.
See, you're really into it, and like I've started looking into it. I've always said this. I remember I did a piece once on dry fly fishing, and my analogy was like, river fishing is poetry, and loch fishing is prose. Right? And I'm big into loch fishing. However, I do dabble a bit in river fishing, and so since this, I had a look at a bit of that, at a bit of Ted Hughes and stuff. Yeah, and it's I'll read it more, definitely.
We'll turn an artist into you yet, Sam.
Jeez, you'd be dragging me kicking and screaming.
Well, come here. I tell you what, look, before we hear from Mark, we might do our competition. First competition we've had on Ireland on the Fly. And it's something we're definitely going to be doing more of in 2023. I have a lot of copies of my books to give away, whether people want them or not.
Excellent. Yeah.
I have a few boxes of them here.
And since then, I can only highly recommend it, and I'll say it to you here because you had sent it to me before. I think it was one of the first podcasts we did, and I haven't read it. I have read it since, and it's absolutely fantastic. And I'll say it here, just with Dara in front of me. Well worth the read. Really fantastic stuff.
Well, I don't think we'll do a book club episode on it now. I think that might be a bit too incestuous, like, you know.
No, we'll do it. I'm going to bring you on as guest.
Stop. And here's 20 copies to give away. And 40 copies for second place. No, but let's do the competition. We have a signed copy of The Catch to give away. And all you have to do is tell us the name of one of Ted Hughes's poems. Email it to info@lastcastmedia.com. So that's info@lastcastmedia.com, lastcastmedia.com. Tell us the name of one of Ted Hughes' poems. Send the email to info@lastcastmedia.com and you could be in with a chance of winning a signed copy of The Catch. But let's hear from Mark Wormald now. And I first asked him to give us some background as to Ted Hughes's life and career.
So Ted Hughes was born in 1930 in Mytholmroyd, West Yorkshire. Met Sylvia Plath in Cambridge, where I'm speaking to you from now. Shortly after he'd graduated from Pembroke College, where I'm a fellow, and that kind of has mattered to me. That's why I've written this book. They spent 7 years together. And in February 1963, Sylvia took her own life. She was a brilliant poet and wrote a very famous novel too called The Bell Jar, exploring her struggles with mental health, actually before she came to Cambridge. And essentially, the fact that she took her own life 7 months after Ted had started a relationship with Assia Wevel, has led to him being regarded as her husband, essentially. And that's the title of a book published about him in the States. And he suffered greatly, as did their two children, Nick and Frida, in the wake of her suicide. He subsequently edited the poems that she wrote in the months leading to her suicide, Ariel, a brilliant, difficult collection. But essentially, and he then suffered the loss in 1969 of Assia Wevel, his partner, and their 3-year-old daughter, Shura. And she took her own life and Shura's life following Sylvia's method. And so he has become known for his private life. Actually, and those horrors. and they haunted him. And in the last year of his life, 1998, he published a book called Birthday Letters, which, having been silent for years, that was the story of and an answer to Sylvia. And there these letters dedicated to and written as if to Sylvia, addressed to Sylvia. But I think that emphasis completely overlooks the fact that he was one of the 20th century's greatest nature writers, and that he was a father to Nick and Frida. And I got into this book when I discovered that he had written fishing diaries for the last 20 years of his life. And Ted started fishing when he was 4, carried on until the summer in which he died. And so he was a lifelong fisherman, a compulsive salmon fisherman, introduced to fly fishing by Barry Cook in Ireland. And it was, as he said, he told Barry's daughter, Anya, who I've got to know well, fishing was his way of breathing. It was his way of processing the natural world. So the book became an attempt to follow in his footsteps, to fish where he had fished, wherever possible, the right pools on the right rivers at the right time of day on the right day of the year, and then reading the poems, amazing poems that he wrote in the light of those experiences, having done what he did to a great fishing writer that he loved. And so that's where the book came. But I just wanted to kind of reorient, kind of not to let him off any hook, you know, a kind of fishing cliche, but in terms of, because he is, you know, he was unfaithful to his wife, but he was not the only man in the 20th century who was unfaithful to his wife. But actually just to kind of ground my book and wherever it took me really in the light of his experience as a fisherman. Sorry, that's a long answer, but I hope that's okay.
No, it's brilliant. And I think that'll give people a sense. And he was also made Poet Laureate in England, in the UK, 1984. Exactly. Like, we're not
made an Order of Merit, admitted to the Order of Merit in October 1998. He basically started fishing, not as a fly fisherman, but then I think very few people start fly fishing at the age of 4, using a net made from the kitchen net curtains in Mytholmroyd in the Rochdale Canal. He ended up fishing every May with the Queen Mother at Burke Hall on the River Dee. But he was known, and I don't say this in the book, he was known to one of his closest fishing friends on the River Torridge in Devon, where he lived from 1961, as a great killer of fish. He would do anything to catch and contact fish. He subsequently became, because of his care for the fish and the rivers and the famine and the horrifying kind of assault on wild salmonid stocks as a result of netting and pollution of those rivers, he became a great environmentalist and conservationist.
Like a true angler as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sure.
There's so much I want to tease out of this. I don't know.
Sorry, I'll shut up. Sorry, I just get carried away with all this.
No, because this is brilliant. Like, and again, we keep coming back to people. I go, why the hell are they talking about Ted Hughes for this Ireland on the Fly podcast? It struck me, and again, what I want to kind of put into context is Ted Hughes' standing reputation, and how well respected he was within the world of literature. He was friends with Seamus Heaney, who went on to become a Nobel laureate as well. What struck me was that for somebody of such standing, that he brought nature writing and nature poetry, I think, to such a massive public space, but also such a respected space as well. And was the kind of highlight of that, would you say, his collection of poems, The River, which was published in 1983?
It is for me, absolutely. I mean, he published his first book, The Hawk in the Rain, in 1957, and was immediately interested, having fished but also hunted as a boy, first in West Yorkshire, then in South Yorkshire. He was completely compelled by animal life. And he got the fact that nature depends on predation. And he identified with the predators, but also the victims somehow. And he just saw the cycles of life and death in the animal world as absolutely central to life as we as humans lived it. And he said, you know, you could sublimate this. You could, in watching football or playing, or playing soccer or rugby, or there is a kind of disguised, developed, sublimated form of that predatory instinct, which he says is there in every single celled organism up. And it's a passion. But fishing, he said, was the purest expression of that.
I'm trying to get at why he was, like, for the time, what he was writing about. Was this like a shot out of the ball? It's not like poets have written about nature and the wonder of nature down through the centuries, but in the 20th century, was this quite unique? It was.
Poets, absolutely. There's a great tradition in nature writing, but there is an expression of the wonder of nature, or the way the natural world corresponds to some elements in ourselves. He I think came as close or closer than any 20th century poet to that idea of Tennyson's of nature red in tooth and claw. But I think he went beyond Tennyson in the sense of admiration for what fish actually in particular, but leopards and foxes, for their relationship with the kind of I'm struggling, because the fox or the leopard and fish needed their wits about them. They lived wholly in the moment. And for Ted, excitement was a whole body experience. And that there needed to be some danger in this, the sense that as hunter, you could also be hunted. So actually, Ted quite liked poaching, because that element of trespass, of being caught, that was as close as he could get to. And he saw the idea of hunting and fishing, hoping to stimulate, to interest something magical and mysterious below the surface, not just of water, but of yourself, and contacting that ancient energy. He saw that was very close to the kind of the fundamental poetic experience. And so there was an identity between fishing, hunting, and writing of poems. And those did absolutely come together, in my view, but also in the view of kind of leading poets and writers I trust, like kind of Simon Armitage, poet laureate now, and Max Porter, great writer. I think that reached its finest expression in River. And he took 7 years writing River, from 1976 to 83. And those were the years in which he started keeping fishing diaries, but also with his son, Nick, started coming to Ireland to fish, not just on the fly, but with their great friend, Barry Cook, the artist and environmentalist and fisherman. So
just to give people an interest, and this is kind of how I came across Ted in terms of his poetry, was the River Collection. And just for anglers listening to this, in terms of kind of, if you go to the contents, just the poems, the names of them will give you some interest. And if you're an angler, you can't but fail to be interested. The Mayfly is frail, Milesian encounter on the Sligacawn, night arrival of sea trout and eel, kingfisher, everything is on its way to the river, August evening, late night, be a dry fly purist, salmon taking times, go fishing the river, stealing trout on a May morning, September salmon, you could go on. This is a collection for fly anglers if ever there was.
But that's absolutely true. And it stares fishermen in the face, the obviousness of that collection. Amazingly, when this was reviewed in the Times Literary Supplement in 1983, December 1983, Peter Redgrove, who's a friend of Ted's and a fine poet in his own right, kind of sung its praises, but never once mentioned fishing. And actually, a lot of these poems are not about catching fish. So, but they can be completely impossible without it. And I just wanted to say, one of the poems you mentioned, Go Fishing, speaks to a feature of Ted's experience of fishing, which and I don't know whether it's true for you guys. He claimed he'd never come across anyone who'd experienced this, but so intense was his concentration on the life of the river and what lay beneath the surface, but also flies coming off, atmospheric conditions. He lost himself so completely to that experience that he said for several hours after coming back from the river, when he'd been fishing alone, he lost the power of forming words. he couldn't speak. And so actually these diaries and then the poems he wrote from them were the way in the words came back.
Hi, Mark. Yeah, I'd
Hi.
seen that you'd written that piece about him, how he lost that after he came back from fishing. I think that's amazing. But are you saying that then he would revert back to his diaries and then, so that's how he went about it?
He basically wrote to a guy called Carl Miller, who was a friend of his, and basically he's a book called Moortown, and he was also a farmer. He wrote these diary poems from farming, visceral engagement with, the life of a ewe lambing or a cow calving, and life and death on the farm. He basically said that fishing, like farming, is an absolutely non-verbal experience. And basically he asked Carl Miller in 1980 to collect an award that Moortown had been given because he was fishing in Alaska with Nick at that point, his son. And he also said, actually, I've started keeping diaries as a way of alternating between the complete non-verbal immersion in the life of the water and my own professional life of words. And it was that oscillation between fishing diaries and the fishing that really awoke me to the possibilities of me writing and trying to recover that somehow.
You sort of came upon those, I won't say by accident, but you weren't you weren't aware of the diaries, or they weren't it wasn't widely acknowledged.
Ted Hughes was a student at Pembroke College, where I'm a fellow. And though everyone knew he'd been a great poet and he was an honorary fellow, no one actually remembered where he lived, in which room that he had when he was here. And I discovered that after having read some letters of his in Emory University in Atlanta. And in 2010, we were asked to host a conference on Ted's work because Emory had hosted the last one because they just had what they thought were all of his papers. By 2010, Ted's widow Carol had sold the remainder of his papers, including these fishing diaries, to the British Library. And this conference that we hosted in Pembroke had Jonathan Bate, who was engaged in writing a biography of Ted, as our plenary lecturer. And he said, the literary biographer faces a particular problem because there's too much material in the archive to know what to do with. But fortunately, he said, only some of it is of relevance to the literary biographer. Then he said, for instance, there are these fishing diaries, by implication, not interesting at all. It's just a hobby. And because I'd always fished from the age of 5, I just thought, well, hey, I'm going to have fun with this. And I went down and reading them kind of changed my life. I was immediately hooked.
How large were they? Were they was it?
They're about 1,000 pages in total.
Wow.
Many of the pages are kind of water stained, so clearly written either in the rain or by the water. Quite a number of them are in verse. So you saw. So this is not in the book because I made it a principle that I wanted to fish in his footsteps wherever I could. And the majority of the poems in River are written in England, Scotland, and Ireland. So that's what I've done. But a few are written from British Columbia and Alaska. And I haven't been able to afford the airfare. But, if someone's prepared to offer me the trip, then I will.
Podcast in that, Mark.
And in fact, there is a pair of Ted's neoprene waders waiting for me on a ranch in British Columbia if I can get there, apparently. Mind you, they'll be a bit old at this point. And still.
Can I just pick up on that, Mark? I'm fascinated because what you're saying is, so the kind of literary side of things, the academic side of things, saw Ted's fishing as separate to Ted.
People who knew him, there was an editor at the Times Literary Supplement said, quite early on this, everyone knew Ted liked fishing, but they just regarded it as a hobby, right?
Only non-anglers would think that.
Yeah. But then there was someone else, a wonderful novelist who's become a really good friend, Graham Swift, who wrote a book called Waterland. He did the anthology with David Profumo, the Magic Wheel. Yeah.
That's fantastic.
And so one of the great days of my life was I went fishing with David and Graham on the River Itchen, and they have signed for me my copy of the Magic Wheel, which is just kind of really amazing.
Class.
But when Ted died in October 1998, Graham Swift was on a book tour in Iceland, which Ted and Nick Hughes visited in 1979 as it happened. And Graham wrote this essay called Fishing with Ted, saying, The man I knew on the River Torridge in Devon was a complete countryman. He was so immersed in the life of the water, but he said, I couldn't imagine, was a different man from the poet, the writer. He was just a man of the river. And he was 100 miles away from that. And actually, because I had been looking at Ted's letters, correspondence with Graham Swift, and therefore in the British Library, and knew that Graham Swift's address, I just wrote to him out of the blue and said, with respect, I disagree. I think actually the poet was the fisherman. And so Graham said, that's amazing. I'd really like to talk to you more about this. And so he spent 2 days in my room here in college, just talking not just about his deep love of Ted and the inspirational qualities to the man, but also just sharing his own fishing memories with me, because there is something about fishing memories that go deeper and are more primal than most other memories. I think. I guess you agree.
Totally. Can I ask you, Mark, I just want to bring it back to Ireland and focus on Ireland, because I think we've given people a good background and a good grounding in terms of Ted and his influence and his standing. Yeah. He stayed in Connemara with Sylvia Plath in the early 60s. Is that right?
He did. But actually, he first visited with his uncle Walt in 1951. And that was when he first saw a salmon fly fisherman on a river in County Limerick from a bridge. But then he was introduced by a guy called Jack Sweeney, he was Irish-American, worked at Harvard University and ran their Woodbury Poetry Room. And in 1957, 58, Ted and Sylvia were in the States, and Jack Sweeney recorded their poems, recorded them reading. And it was the first kind of, and made a record of them. And he sent this record to Barry Cook, the artist, British-born artist who had, on Jack Sweeney's recommendation, gone to Ireland in 1954 and started living in incredibly primitive conditions on the Burren, basically sent there on the advice of Jack Harris, who wrote, an Anglo-entomologist, and the Anglo-entomology, rather, because he turned up in his fishing tackle shop in Dublin on Parliament Street and said, where's the best fishing in Ireland? And so he said, come back in a bit. And he spread out this map and said, you need to go to the River Fergus. And so Barry drove across Ireland on his motorbike with a blanket and a fishing rod, and that was it, and started sleeping on a friend's floor. And then he found this primitive cottage. And basically Ted was introduced to him in 1958 by Jack Sweeney. Jack said they thought they shared a passion for the natural world and violence, these two guys, and that's true. And they corresponded. Barry met Ted and Sylvia when they came back from the States early in 1960. But then the last week that Ted and Sylvia spent together as husband and wife was in Connemara, and they went and visited Richard Murphy in Cleggan. And halfway through the week, Ted just disappeared and went down south to County Clare, or so the story was, to fish for salmon and trout with Barry Cook. Now, Assia Wevel's biographers and others thought that's just code for having a fling with Assia, gone fishing, yeah. But actually, a letter exists, and it's now in a collection of Barry's papers at Pembroke, amazingly, from Ted to Barry, thanking him for the time and apologizing for having broken one of his rods. And my guess is that's his first attempt to fly cast, and he got it wrong.
I was actually looking up that. I spotted that bit about Barry Cook, and apparently, and this is an interesting crossover, because I don't know how true it is, but it says that he brought him to the Mulcair River to fish.
Yeah, that's true.
It's interesting, as hopefully further down the line, you read Thomas McGuane's The Longest Silence, he fishes the Mulcair River.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And I've read The Longest Silence. I will go back to it. Thank you.
Go back and have a look. One of the local guys in, I think it's the town he's in, is it Kilmallock, brings him to the Mulcair River. Wow. So there's a bit of a crossover.
Yeah,
there.
Absolutely. Yeah. How amazing. Yeah, so then they fished together. And and then when, after Sylvia's death, then Ted and Assia came back to Connemara in 1966 to live for a few months. and they arrived in February, stayed until May. And to start with, they lived at a place called Doonregan near Cashel on the southern coast of Connemara. And Ted had heard that Loch Fadder was home to a kind of Loch Ness monster equivalent, a plesiosaur, and he took the kids in a gale, really early season, to fish Loch Fadder. And the kids at that point were 6 and 4, the two older ones, and he took them there and caught a sea trout. But then they moved to Cleggan, and he took them both to fishing on Loch Ochrisberg, at Ochrisberg, and caught. And he said he wanted to get them to fish, the kids, to stir the dormant passion for the art. And the fact that he believed it was dormant within us all, and Frida was interested but thought it was a bit cruel. Nick was very keen, and that started Nick fishing, and they caught trout there.
Did you fish Ochris, by the way? Did you get to fish it?
I did, but it was on a day where I'd been out to High Island, which Richard Murphy had owned.
Yeah.
And in fact, Takin Mulcairn, who owns it now, took me out, and I shared a boat with a guy from Historic Ireland, or one of, because there's a kind of Brian Borrow's well and various kind of beehive cells out on a monastery out on High Island. And he's a fisherman. And he said it's not worth fishing Loch Ochrisberg because French and German anglers had kind of introduced roach to it, and then roach and perch had basically eaten all the trout eggs, and then the trout have died out. But I had to go anyway, and I caught a roach on the fly. So honour was even.
Can I ask you, Mark, again, the importance of Ireland? Because there's a couple of lines here I took from your book where after Platt's death, the importance of fishing, he describes it as Ted said, it means finding a place and a way of life where this is possible.
Yeah.
And that taking the kids to Ireland, he says, where the life flows unself-consciously in the people and with lots of freedom. And also fishing and shooting are at the dead center of the visual field. And he talks about when he goes to, when he's staying in Connemara, that the life flowed.
Yeah.
And you really get this sense of kind of the trauma and post Sylvia Plath.
Completely.
He refines himself, his fishing, his poetry, his writing.
Absolutely. Even. He started writing Crow, which a kind of traumatized but brilliant mythic masterpiece published in 1970. That he started writing that in Connemara. He also revised his broadcast that he'd made in 1961 and onwards, called Listening and Writing for school kids, and a particular one of those is called Learning to Think, and he talks about how he learned to think out of school while fishing. And it's a wonderful essay. But he said, unless we manage to make a raid on the mental stuff, the thinking that goes on us unconsciously, like breathing all the time, if we don't do that, then our thoughts will lie in us like fish in the pond of a man who cannot fish. And it's an amazing insight. So it makes an inability to fish like a disability somehow, like a cognitive impairment, which is such a brilliant thing. Anyway, Barry and his second wife, Sonia Landwehr, came and met them in Connemara in 1966. They then went back, and Barry met Nick and Frida, and they started getting on with each other famously at that point. And Ted felt more creative than he'd ever felt before somehow in Ireland, and associated that. Then when Assia took her own life and Shura, their daughters, in 1969, Ted just turned up at Barry and Sonia's house on the River Nore, the island, unannounced, and just in silence helped Barry pack some paintings for an exhibition, and then told them about this awfulness, and they fished all day. That's all Barry said. But fishing was a way of healing, essentially, after loss. And then Barry, from about 1971, when he built his own tiny little pike fishing boat out of fiberglass, which is known as his coracle, he started trying to persuade Nick and Ted to come over, and sent Nick homemade wooden pike plugs with teeth marks on them. And Nick was completely hooked by this. And that actually finally led in 1977 to the first of what became 2 or 3 times a year trips to Ireland to fish for pike, salmon, trout, and that was coincided with Ted's major work on river.
Talk to me a little bit about Barry Cook, because it seems like a fascinating guy. He was, as you've given us the background to him in terms of moving over to Ireland. He was living then in Kilkenny, beside the River Nore. Really interesting. He was friends with Seamus Heaney. So did he introduce Seamus Heaney? Okay, and did he introduce Heaney to Ted Hughes? Or
no? Ted had met Seamus in, I think, 1967, and then they met in Ireland in 1968, which was the year that Seamus met Barry, because Barry was commissioned by another mutual friend, John Montague, to do the cover artwork for a Cladder Records reading by John and Seamus called The Northern Muse, which is very watery. And Seamus by that point had written a Loch Ness sequence about eel fishing in Loch Ness and other kind of fishy poems. Although Seamus was never a great fisherman, he said, you know, it took him back to his childhood, and he said, you know, a dozen fishing trips, which happened mostly in Barry's company once with Ted in Devon, was enough for a lifetime of poetry. And he wrote brilliantly about everything, but about fishing too. But he knew Barry. He had first seen Barry's painting in 1965, I think, years before they met. But then in 1971, November, Barry and Sonia invited Seamus and Mari Heaney for dinner at the island, this house beside and sometimes in the River Nore, because it flooded, and it was a famously cold, wet house. But they arrived, and in the hallway was an enormous pike, which Barry proceeded to gut, and then they had it for dinner. And basically that was Seamus and Barry coming as close as two heterosexual males happily married could come to falling in love with each other. And they had this amazing, intense relationship thereafter for the rest of their lives. And by that point, I think Seamus was in awe of Ted and a great admirer of him. They became closer later. So my next book is called Casting and Gathering, which is the title of a poem Seamus wrote for Ted for his 60th birthday, remembering as a boy hearing two fishermen on opposite banks of the River Moyler. And I don't think that works, to be honest, with one kind of like a corn crate stripping line out, and the other the hush and lush of a line casting to and fro. And I'm pretty sure this childhood memory is overlaid on Seamus and Ted and Barry, essentially being two fishermen together.
Barry Cook was a big influence on Ted in terms of the fishing in Ireland, wasn't it? Like he would
Completely.
bring him to the rivers, show him where to fish.